Good morning. Shabbat shalom. Trying to beat me to it. I'm going to have to be quick on the draw with Jonathan over there. Good morning. So we're going to continue in Nehemiah this morning in our series on Nehemiah. And I don't know about you, but I've been thoroughly enjoying just going through this and preparing these chapters because, to be completely honest, I've never slowed down enough to see just how great this book is. I've looked at the bigger picture of the book, which is good, but there's just so many good little gems throughout this book that are just great. And if you're just now catching up, we have Nehemiah who has prayed to go to Jerusalem and help them rebuild, and he's rebuilt in the face of lots of opposition. He's rebuilt in the face of people wanting to kill him, to mock him, and to stop the progress of building the wall, but they weren't successful. With the help of God, they've been able to rebuild the wall and to defeat their enemies. And so this morning we're in chapter 7, and I think it's a great chapter. It's long. I think it's 73 verses. Some of them are really short. It's just a couple names. But I really looked at the chapter and I thought we might spend the whole morning reading the chapter. But we'll start here and read the whole chapter because that's what we've been doing, and I think it's important. So if you want to join me in Nehemiah chapter 7. Starting in verse 1, it says, "When the wall had been rebuilt and I had the doors installed, the gatekeepers, singers, and Levites were appointed. Then I put my brother Hananiah in charge of Jerusalem, along with Hananiah, commander of the fortress, because he was a faithful man who feared God more than most. I said to them, 'Do not open the gates of Jerusalem until the sun is hot, and let the doors be shut and securely fastened while the guards are on duty. Station the citizens of Jerusalem as guards, some at their posts and some at their homes.' The city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and no houses had been built yet. Then my God put into my mind to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the people to be registered by genealogy. I found the genealogical record of those who came back first, and I found the following written in it. These are the people of the province who went up among the captive exiles deported by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Each of them returned to Jerusalem and Judah to his own town. They came with Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Azariah, Raamiah, Nahamani, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispereth, Bigvai, Nahum, and Baanah. The number of Israelite men included Perosh's descendants, Shephatiah's descendants. Those were 2,172 and 372. Arah's descendants, 652. Pahath Moab's descendants, Yeshua's and Joab's descendants, 2,818. Elam's descendants, 1,254. Zatu's descendants, 845. Zakai's descendants, 760. Binui's descendants, 648. Bebai's descendants, 628. Azgad's descendants, 2,322. Adonikam's descendants, 667. Bigvai's descendants, 2,067. Aidan's descendants, 655. Ader's descendants of Hezekiah, 98. Hashum's descendants, 328. Bezai's descendants, 324. Harif's descendants, 112. Gibeon's descendants, 95. Bethlehem's and Netophah's men, 188. Anatot's men, 128. Beth Asmaveth's men, 42. Kiriath Yearim's, Hepherah's and Beeroth's men, 743. Ramah's and Gebah's men, 621. Mikmah's men, 122. Bethel's and Ai's men, 123. The other Nebo's men, 52. The other Elam's people, 1,254. Harim's people, 320. Jericho's people, 345. Lod's, Hadid's, and Ono's people, 721. Sina'ah's people, 3,930. The priests included Jediah's descendants of the house of Yeshua, 973. Emer's descendants, 1,052. Pashur's descendants, 1,247. Harim's descendants, 1,017. The Levites included Yeshua's descendants of Kadmiel, Hadavah's descendants 74. The singers included Asaph's descendants 148. The gatekeepers included Shallum's descendants, Ater's descendants, Talmon's descendants, Akub's descendants, Hatitah's descendants, Shobai's descendants 138. The temple servants included Zihah's descendants, Hasupha's descendants, Tabaot's descendants, Keros's descendants, Sia's descendants, Padon's descendants, Lebanon's descendants, Hagabah's descendants, Halmai's descendants, Hanan's descendants, Gidel's descendants, Gahar's descendants, Reiah's descendants, Rezin's descendants, Nekodah's descendants, Gazam's descendants, Uzzah's descendants, Paseah's descendants, Besai's descendants, Meunim's descendants, Nephishasim's descendants, Bakbut's descendants, Hakufah's descendants, Harhur's descendants, Basli's descendants, Mehidah's descendants, Harshah's descendants, Barkos's descendants, Sisera's descendants, Tamah's descendants, Neziah's descendants, Hatifah's descendants. The descendants of Solomon's servants included Sotai's descendants, Sopheret's descendants, Peridah's descendants, Ja'alah's descendants, Darkon's descendants, Gidel's descendants, Shephatiah's descendants, Hatil's descendants, Pokereth Hezbaim's descendants, Ammon's descendants. All the temple servants and the descendants of Solomon's servants, 392. The following are those who came from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Adon, and Immer, but were unable to prove that their ancestral families and their lineage were Israelite. Delaiah's descendants, Tobiah's descendants, and Nekodah's descendants, 642. And from the priests, the descendants of Hobiah, the descendants of Hakoz, and the descendants of Barzillai, who had taken a wife from the daughters of Barzillai, and the Gileadite, and who bore their name. These searched for their entries in the genealogical records, but they could not be found, so they were disqualified from the priesthood. The governor ordered them not to eat the most holy things until there was a priest who could consult the Urim and the Thummim. The whole combined assembly numbered 42,360, not including their 7,337 male and female servants, as well as their 245 male and female singers. They had 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. Some of the family heads contributed to the project. The governor gave 1,000 gold coins, 50 bowls, and 530 priestly garments to the treasury. Some of the family heads gave 20,000 gold coins and 2,200 silver minas to the treasury for the project. The rest of the people gave 20,000 gold coins, 2,000 silver minas, and 67 priestly garments. The priests, Levites, gatekeepers, temple singers, some of the people, temple servants, and all Israel settled in their towns. And the second half of that verse will attach to next week's, or the next time we're in Nehemiah. So amen and praise God for Nehemiah chapter 7. So when we look at this chapter and we look at all of this, sometimes we get really confused, or sometimes we think, what is the point of listing all of these names and these genealogies? And I think we'll get there as we go through the chapter, as we go back through it, not reading back through it, but going back through it and discussing it. But I think it's very important to understand that Nehemiah here teaches us that restoration is about more than physical structures. It's about building a holy and a thriving community. Because Nehemiah could have built the walls. He could have had the walls rebuilt, but without anybody living in them, what does it matter? What does it amount for? What does it count for? And we could have, up to this point, had that thought that he's building these walls for the wall's purpose or for protection's purpose. But all along, I've tried to remind us that he's doing this so that they could restore a holy community that could and would worship God like he had intended. There's a story of a pastor. His name was Jim Dawson. He was a pastor in Arkansas. and he was known for his quick wit and his down-to-earth humor. And he was preparing the congregation for their annual outdoor summer picnic, and the church was surrounded by lots of woods. It's middle of like Ozarks, Arkansas, and every year raccoons seemed to sense when the potluck was happening, and they'd lurk over the picnic tables waiting for someone to leave a casserole dish out or unguarded so that they could take it back for them. And one Sunday before the event, he stood at the pulpit and he said, "Now I know our mission is to save souls, but let's not forget another important ministry this week, keeping Sister Martha's famous chicken casserole safe from the raccoons. Because let me tell you, those raccoons have never once put anything in the offering plate." So I think that, it's really important that there is provision. It is important that there is protection. It is important that there are these things in place so that the people could know that they could live and not be under threat of death or under threat of persecution or under threat of manipulation that had been coming their way. But it's also important to realize that the entire purpose of that was so that they could show up to the potluck and give God thanks. And I think just as Jerusalem needed both physical protection and a vibrant community, the same goes for us. That we're called to restore and to guard our communities of faith, that we're called to be putting up hedges of protection, to be able to allow our faith communities to thrive and to grow. And that means a lot of different things. That means putting up physical protections for people, making sure that when we see people that are in danger physically, that we are there to advocate on their behalf. It means being there when we see spiritual persecution, when we see mental persecution, those types of things. Recently, I've been working with someone who, not from this area, but has been to our congregation, who entered into a marriage and became very abusive. And while it wasn't necessarily physical abuse, he was taking the scriptures and using those in the most twisted ways. And it's caused a lot of damage. We have to be able to set up guards in our communities to make sure that these types of things don't happen. That people know that there are people that will set people straight whenever they start using the scriptures and the Word of God in the wrong way. When we look at verses 1 through 3, the first few verses of this chapter here, these 3 verses of the chapter kind of conclude the first part of Nehemiah's memoir. We talked earlier in the series about how Ezra and Nehemiah are really the memoirs of these 2 guys, Ezra and Nehemiah. But Nehemiah kind of takes a break from the memoir for a little while, and this is kind of the concluding part of it. And we see that although Nehemiah has won the battle against his enemies for the present, he's still concerned about the security moving forward. He's still concerned about what he can put into place to ensure that the safety and the protection of the people continues to last. And he puts in effect measures to protect it here in these few verses. Like in verse 1, after hanging the doors to the gateways of the city, he reestablishes the traditional groups of the temple, of those people that were working in the temple service, the gatekeepers, the singers, the Levites. Sometimes we think about different parts of ministry in different ways, but I was encouraged in this chapter here that multiple times the singers were listed along with the leaders of the city, along with the leaders of the city and the temple. And sometimes I think people take for granted people that lead worship. I can't sing. Y'all don't want me leading worship. We take for granted the people that sing and lead us in worship. It's very vital, very important to the health of our community. But then he appoints his brother, his trustworthy brother, as the commander of the city, along with guards at the gates. And when we look at verse 2 and we see his brother here, there's some translational issues here in the chapter. I read from the CSB, and I don't ever deviate from that, even if I disagree with it, because I think most of y'all know that that's what I read from. But when we're looking at Hanani and Hananiah, I would suggest they're the same person. He didn't put Hanani and Hananiah as the commander over the city. And if I had to translate it, I would order it differently. I would say this is what it means. And I ordered Hananiah my brother, that is Hananiah the commander of the fortress, to take charge of Jerusalem. And so I would suggest they're the same person. He's putting his most trustworthy person in charge of the city. I think it's important since many of the residents that were related to and committed to supporting his other adversaries. Remember, just in the last couple chapters, we've seen that some of these people were writing letters to Tobiah and Sanballat, and they were saying things against the leadership of Jerusalem. I think Nehemiah needed some loyalties that were similar to what his enemies were being entrusted with. I think that family loyalty, that of Hananiah, appears to be the most important criterion for him as he establishes the protection moving forward. If I think about today's time frame and how we think about that, a lot of people would have accused him of, nepotism. But I think it was very important for him at the time. We should, it's not always true, but we should be able to trust our family, especially our close blood relatives, the most. Sadly, sometimes that's not the case. But he puts them in place here so that he could protect the city. Verse 3, he says that the city is broad. He says that there's this big city, but it's closed during the hot hours. And again, I would disagree with my CSB here, that it's really speaking to when the guards, or when it's hot outside, they would take a break. And if I had to think about myself, if I'm out there working in the hot sun, that's usually when I'm the most tired. That's usually when I might need to take a break, a siesta. It's almost like he puts into place this break in the middle of the day in the hottest hours where the guards needed to rest so that they could stay vigilant at the rest of the day. There's some places where, in some translations, and yours may say this, that understand this instruction as securing the gates until the heat of the day. So not opening, and that's kind of how the CSB does it. Not opening the gates until it gets hot. I'm not sure why we would want to do that, but maybe they weren't familiar with Louisiana heat. Some of them say that they would secure the city during the night until daylight. Well, that would be kind of obvious. I think that's what they would do without an instruction. And so for me, I think it's most likely the sense that while the sun is hot, that they close the gates, that they would rest from their vigilant duty, and they would be able to secure the city more appropriately. And in addition to securing these people that would be guards, he also organized this neighborhood watch. He gets all the people together and organizes this neighborhood watch, and he assigns each of the residents of Jerusalem, each of them, all of them, the responsibility of watching out for both their own homes and the homes of their neighbors. And when we think about that, it's just like the building project. It's just like when they started rebuilding the walls, whenever he went out, and it wasn't just taking the people that were usually workers, it was the entire city who put in an effort to make sure that the walls were built. And here, the same instruction is given when it comes to guarding and having the responsibility of looking after our neighbors. As I think about this, I think, there's a lot of physical nature to what's going on here. Let's look after our neighbors. Let's make sure nobody breaks in their house. That's definitely it. But I think we also have the task of guarding what God has given us as a spiritual responsibility. That we have the responsibility of others. I think it's interesting that Nehemiah chooses leaders who feared God more than themselves, who feared God more than other people, who feared God above all else. And I think integrity is key to leadership, and I think that's what he was looking at. Whether it's church or family or work or community, when it comes to leaders, we have to have leaders with integrity. He put people in place that he knew wouldn't falter. He knew wouldn't become lax. He knew would stay the course. I think integrity is always important. There's a boy who walked into the kitchen with crumbs on his face and an empty cookie jar in his hand, and his mom asked, "Did you take the last cookie after I told you not to?" And he said, "Technically, I didn't take it. I ate it right here." And he reminded her about a lesson she told him about integrity. I think integrity is really important. Sometimes I'm reminded of what it means when we don't have leaders with integrity, when we have people who are self-serving, who are really looking to see what they can do for themselves at the expense of others, when real leadership is looking to see what we can do for others. I think Nehemiah ensured that the gates were guarded during the most vulnerable times. When we think about the vulnerable times, the times when it was most likely that they would be attacked. At a time where if the enemy is watching, they would see that in the heat of the day, and they would know it from their own experience, that that's when guards become lax. There's a story from 2023 where Detroit launched this thing called the Shot Stoppers program, where they basically took a bunch of funds that they had gotten from grants and different things, and they kind of funneled it out to some grassroots organizations to reduce homicide and shootings in the city. And they had different groups where they would employ different strategies, but in the end, their efforts led to a remarkable reduction in violent crime, up to 83% in some of the areas. 83%. And I really think about this. It took some leaders in that community to say, we've got to stop thinking about ourselves. We've got to start thinking about our neighbors. We've got to start thinking about what are the most vulnerable places where we can be attacked. Detroit's notorious for violence. And surely there's a lot of people there who put bars on their windows, who locked their doors, who had self and individual protection through firearms or whatever. I've been there, I've done it myself, but it took some leadership to say, that's fine, you've got your protection, but what are we doing for everyone else? What are we doing to make sure that our vulnerable areas grow and become less vulnerable? I think more importantly than the physical idea of that is something like Proverbs 4:23 says, guard your heart above all else, for it's the source of life. I think that we have a spiritual responsibility to help guard each other's spiritual lives. That we have the responsibility to see everyone in this room and people who aren't in this room and say, when are they most vulnerable when it comes to their spiritual lives, and how can we help them not be that way? We have to guard our hearts. We have to guard each other's hearts. Times like temptation or complacency or distraction. It's really sad when I think about, I was reading this verse or this chapter this week, and I was thinking about how many people out there really would come to me and really would hold me accountable in a weak moment. Sadly, I couldn't think of many. I'll name one, my wife. She's quick to hold me accountable when I'm not doing what I need to be doing, or I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing. But sadly, I don't know that there's that many people that would come to me and say, I don't think that you should be doing this. Or you should be doing this. But we all should be doing that. We all should be willing to hold each other accountable. We all should be willing to stand up for someone else's spiritual walk, their spiritual vulnerabilities. And then on the flip side, we should all be willing to accept it. And that's tough. I think everyone has a role in this concept. Just like here, he called every single person to be part of the neighborhood watch. Every person in this room has a responsibility for everyone else in this room. Every single person. When we look beyond the first 3 verses here, it really gets into the genealogy, but I think that what's important is that we see that Nehemiah realizes that the strength of his community lies in its people. And that it's not just in its people, not just in the structure of what's there. It's not just putting people into a structured place of governance, but it's putting the right people in places where they should be. I think he realizes that the city needed people in order to thrive, but he focuses on the integrity of the people. He focuses on the history of the people. When we look at verse 4, we see that the wall was the first priority and was rebuilt before the houses. I thought that was interesting. You know, if you look at the story of whenever Israel returns from Babylon, prior to this, and God calls them to go and build his house, it says that the people were more concerned about building their own houses. But here, under good leadership, here under leadership that God has ordained and has allowed to go into Jerusalem and to lead them into rebuilding the city, the people have rebuilt the city before they've rebuilt their own houses. I think that there were definitely houses there. Most of them probably needed to be repaired. And in verse 5, we see that Nehemiah secured the city wall, and he turns his attention to rebuilding the population. He recognizes that the final strength of a city is not in the stones, but in the people. And he begins gathering a census of the residents. Now, if you're like me, I hear that phrase and I say, uh-oh, something's not good here, because we have examples where census taking was bad, but I think the text is clear that this was a divinely prompted census, that this was something that God was leading Nehemiah to do, as opposed to what David does whenever he's relying on the number of troops instead of the power of God. But here he committed himself to this really strenuous task of collecting and gathering the data of all the individuals and their ancestries. As someone who has loved Ancestry before, I think Nehemiah could have benefited from Ancestry.com. Probably would have helped his efforts. But he discovered the official record of the genealogy while he was doing this of those who had first returned from Babylon. And I think, man, he would have been relieved probably to know that his efforts were shortcutted. And the record provided continuity for the community. It allowed them to say who were the people that went through exile and who were the people who came back and who are the people that we know we can put into place. And he starts looking at the ancestry and he starts using that to say these people can come into the city. And if I really think about that, I really think, man, that's not a good approach. But I think it was appropriate for this time because they had to know who they could trust. But what does this serve to increase the population of the city? What does this serve, especially if we're cutting some people out and not allowing them to come in? There's a scholar, Williamson, who suggests that the goal was to determine who had ancestral roots in the city and should therefore be moved into it to maintain integrity, at least in the early years. I think that resettling Jerusalem was probably easier said than done. I think that going through this task of trying to figure out who was going to live where, while meanwhile there were still enemies that surrounded the city, would have provided a hard task. I think the genealogical record gave them some continuity and allowed them to make some decisions, but eventually, we'll see this later on, Nehemiah really has to force settlers to come into Jerusalem. Some of them don't want to come. He forces 10% of the community later on in chapter 11 to come into it. If you're familiar with Nehemiah and Ezra, you'll know that this list really corresponds to Ezra 2. If you're not familiar, now you know. But there are some differences between the two, occasional differences. But I think that these lists provide not only genealogical ancestry, but also places of former residences within the homeland. It tells us not just who came back from the exiles, but also where they lived and where they settled and how they were spread out. But when we look at the two and we see some differences, we see that many of the population numbers are different. We see that the names are slightly different. They may be spelled different or in a different order. But I think if we look at the total, we'll see that they're the same. And this comes from probably two different scribes working on two different texts. And while they got the same number at the bottom, we have to remember that they didn't have Grammarly or Fact Check or whatever. Back in the ancient world, they couldn't recalculate their numbers. They're going from one scroll, looking back, and probably making some differences. But they had the same amount when it came to the end. I think that Nehemiah 7 is probably our more accurate of the two lists. When we look at it, it has greater clarity, more precise data. Some would say it's a revision of Ezra 2. I don't think that's the case. I think that Nehemiah states that he found the list. That helps us realize that he wasn't just looking at Ezra's recording there. But I think all of this really illustrates to us that an empty fellowship or an empty structure, an empty city or an empty church, it may look really good. But without people, it's just a building. Without people, it's just a museum sometimes. Some of the greatest, most beautiful churches in the world have no one that actually attends services. They're just museums for people to go and see. I think that we have to realize that God has placed us in a community, but He's placed us in this community so that we can rebuild and restore a faith that God intended from the beginning. Sometimes it's tough. Anybody feel like it's tough to walk this walk in the community still sometimes? Sometimes it's tough. But I think we're here for a purpose. I think we're here to do some restoration, to do some rebuilding. I think that Nehemiah valued the connection between the past and the present. And I think sometimes we lose that, especially when we lose that within our own faith. We think of our faith, and I'm not talking to everybody here, but just as the church as a whole, the body of Christ as a whole, we think of our faith as just 2024 faith. I think a lot of people get off track because of that, because it's like, what is this Bible for today? What is this Bible for me right now? But it's all within the context of the past. If you're on Wednesday night, we're talking about Revelation, and so we were talking about, we've done 2 weeks of introduction. If you know me, we'll have a third week of introduction and maybe get into the text. But we talked about prophecy and what that really is. And the prophets, I didn't come up with this, scholars greater than me did, but prophecy for the Bible meant walking into the future backwards. We think of prophecy as they were looking forward. They were trying to make predictions about what was to come. That's not what they were doing. They were walking into the future backwards. They're always looking to the past. They're always saying that we can have a hope for the future because of what God has done in the past. And there's this underlying message that happens in this genealogy with Nehemiah as well, where he appreciates the past promises that God has kept. Because that's what's underlying this genealogical record and his listing of who is able to come into the city and who is able to go where based on their lineage. Because those are the people that God promised to bring back, and He did. It's not just a favoritism thing. He's recognizing God's promise that was kept. There's also this idea that the past can sometimes connect us to something that we may have lost. I mentioned Ancestry.com. I remember growing up, my mom said that she had this grandmother that was just like mean as nails, like she didn't ever want to go over there. I can't remember all the stories, but she just wasn't a night, mean old lady on the street. Everybody was scared to go by her house and stuff. I started looking at the genealogy and doing some of that stuff for my family, and I came to her little section, and I realized that at the age of 16, a 48-year-old man married her, forced her to, I don't say forced her, I can't see that, had 10 children with her and then died 10 years, right after the 10th kid was born. Well, I don't know, I'd be kind of bitter too. If that happened, and so sometimes our history can help us understand the present. Sometimes our history can help us understand people. Have you ever looked at people and said, well, I just don't like the way that person acts. I don't like the way the person does stuff. You ever ask why? One of the most unwelcome questions, but one of the most important questions, I believe, is the question why. Why does that person act like that? Why does that person do that? And we make judgments and we look at people and we say, those people shouldn't act that way, or I can't stand that person the way they behave. Nothing sinful about their behavior most of the time. We never ask why. And then sometimes when we do, we can be moved to compassion. We can be moved to compassion for people that have gone through things that we couldn't hardly imagine. Do we really appreciate the legacy that's been given to us? Spiritually, do we really appreciate it? Because sometimes we wield our faith like it's a sword and we cut other people down, but we don't really, if we're doing that, we don't appreciate that what was given to us is a gift we could have never earned ourselves anyway. I think Nehemiah here is appreciating the legacy of God's promises, and sometimes that gets lost in the text here where people think he's just showing favoritism. in verses 70 through 72, towards the end, again, I said I'm not going to read back through the genealogy. We're going to go to the end here. The people here give generously to support the work that's going on. And I'm really reminded of the earlier stories of Israel's history back in Exodus, where Moses at one point had to turn the people away from giving the gold and all the materials that were needed for the tabernacle. He had to turn them away, and he had to say, stop, we've got enough. It's not what happens here, but this is similar language here. And the report of the donations of the people, these were the people who first returned to the homeland. And again, it's in Ezra 2, but it's detailed more here. I think it's interesting that only some of the family leaders donated to the work, but not all of them. That's okay, because the amount of the financial donation was staggering. And I know sometimes we get lost in this. If we look at it, there's a sum of gold here that's 41,000 gold derricks. Anybody know what a derrick was? Not Salter, but D-A-R-I-C. It was just a gold coin. It weighed about 8.4 grams. 8.4 grams. It was about the equivalent, of a month's wages for one of the soldiers, at least at that time. It was the value of a whole ox. And then they gave a bunch of silver minas, which again, what they gave was a lot. A mina was about 1.25 pounds of silver. And so there were over 5,000 pounds of silver. Now, I didn't calculate the silver and the gold and do it all together, but I'll just give you, if you put the gold in today's value of gold, if you take 8.5 grams, multiply it times 41,000, the amount of coins, and then you multiply that times the value of gold in grams today, which is like $85.34 or something. They gave $29,315,328. $29 million worth of gold. These people were committed. These people were willing to sacrifice a lot. Some people giving a whole portion of their wage or a whole year's worth of wages. And the list ends with this summary of various categories of people who go and settle in their towns and their various towns. And it categorizes people, priests and Levites and gatekeepers and again singers. And those are specified along with temple servants. And I think it's interesting. We don't really see that separation a lot. But these were people who ministered, these would be non-Levitical priests who ministered in the temple. And they're given their place as well. But I think a restored community requires sacrificial giving. A community that comes together and starts to build requires sacrifice. It requires not just money. I think we all think of money. This isn't a tithe sermon. I think it requires time. It requires talents. It requires all of us working within our gifts to make sure that we're doing what God has given us to support the community. We all have different gifts. We all have different ways to serve. I remember this past Sunday I was out of town and I'd asked David if he would fill in for me on the Sunday morning service. And I had all these slides and I texted him all this stuff like play this song here and these 3 songs here and all this stuff. And he didn't say anything. He just said, okay, thanks. I think I got it. And then I'm like, how did it go? I asked people how it went. Man, they were great. They sang hymns, played piano. And I'm like, I forgot that he used his talents, him and his wife. They didn't just come and do, I put all this stuff to try to help him, but he knew that he was called not just to come give a message, but to lead music. And I asked them, man, I didn't know he was going to do that. He did that on his own. And they were greatly encouraged. And these are old Southern Baptists who love hymns and love piano playing. They haven't had piano playing in 10 years. They loved it. We've got to use our gifts. We've got to be able to give what God has given us. So if I look at this chapter, and sometimes we look at these chapters and it's kind of hard to see what really should I be taking from this. But I think there's a few things. I think that we should be appointing leaders who fear God in our communities, in our churches, even in our businesses, our workplaces. Someone asked me the other day, It was at Thanksgiving. I don't know if it's related to me or not. It's my sister-in-law, who is my brother-in-law's wife's, her dad, so really not any relation. But he was at Thanksgiving, and he's like, "Did you vote for Trump? Were you excited to vote for Trump? Are you glad of the outcome?" And I just laughed. And he said, "It's okay if you didn't. I'm not going to be mad at you." I said, "No, I'm just laughing that those were our choices. That the choice we were given for a leader of our country were two men that I couldn't say fear God and fear God above others. Two men that I couldn't say had integrity or wisdom or a heart for service. Of course, when it gets time for elections, they all present that. But it's a sad choice that a nation that says we're a Christian nation, a nation that says we're a God-fearing nation. Heck, we make laws about putting 10 Commandments in our schools, and we got rid of abortion. Not really. We got rid of the federal injunction on abortion. And yet those were the people that we had to choose. Those were the people that were given to us. Are we supporting and praying for godly leaders in our community? I'll say that I liken that. I don't always pray for my leaders, the leaders in our community. And I'm not just talking about elected officials, but leaders everywhere. We should be praying for our leaders all over. I think that we have to be more diligent about guarding what matters most. I think that we have to protect our faith, our family, and our congregation from distractions and dangers. For those of you who've been here a long time, we've had a lot of distractions come through here. And if I'm being honest, as one of the leaders here in this congregation, sometimes we've handled it well, sometimes we've not. Sometimes we've allowed distractions to come in and really rock us and deviate from what our mission is here. We have to be able to stand up and say we're guarding over each other in our own lives, our own walks. How are we standing guard over our spiritual lives today? And I think that lastly, we have to invest in our community. We have to recognize that we're part of something bigger. And that investment can look like something that's totally different. An investment for me is time a lot of times. I don't have much of it these days, but I try to invest time. Not just here, but like everywhere. We do a Thursday morning Bible study. Like sometimes it's a lot to get up an extra hour earlier to go to Bible study at 5:30, but I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it to invest in people around us. I think we should invest in our community financially, through time, through our efforts, and really through our gifts. There's a lot of people who don't realize the gifts that they have, or they realize it and they don't really think that they will be welcome or that they should use them. It's one of the saddest things is when people have gifts and don't use them. I think we've got to do that. I think that, every congregation or community is kind of like this quilt pattern where every single piece matters. Every single piece is part of the big picture, but they're totally different. I've had some quilts that, the designs, they put them through a machine, it looks great, but some of the best quilts of my life were ones where, like when I was younger, I had all the race t-shirts, and my grandmother made a quilt out of all the t-shirts. None of them looked the same. It just looked like a hodgepodge of shirts. But that was the best one. When we look at this chapter, I think one of the best verses I see is in verse 2. It says, "He was a man of integrity and feared God more than most people." And fearing God and being a man of integrity brought together a community of thousands of people, 40,000 people. He brought them together for one mission and restored Jerusalem. There's a story from Joplin, Missouri, and I say the word Joplin, y'all probably all know what I'm talking about, where this tornado came through back in 2011 and totally just decimated the city, killed 161 people. And I forgot how bad it was. It was heartbreaking. And all of these people, churches, schools, businesses, they all came together, but one stood out when I was kind of reading back through the story, and it was this St. Mary's Catholic Church. And when it was destroyed, it was like totally wiped out. Wasn't a building left. But they didn't go to their own homes and try to restore their own homes. Before they ever went to look at their own homes, they immediately came and put in work in the efforts in the city to make sure that they took care of other people. They volunteered and mobilized all over the city to make sure that they were doing the work they felt that they were called to do. That as people of God, they were in a city for a reason. And they saw that at least at this point, at this moment, their reason and purpose was to be a mission of hope for people that just had lost all hope. So they mobilized, they poured all over the city, they brought in people from everywhere, and they rebuilt the city. They made it better. But people remarkably, as you look at stories, will talk about St. Mary's Catholic Church. In one of the meetings, a local pastor stood up and said, "We may have lost our buildings, but we haven't lost what makes us strong, our people and our faith." Our people and our faith. I think that unity and determination like that, and like we find in Nehemiah, is so vital for God's people. I heard someone ask me this week. Someone asked me this week, what does hope really look like in the Bible? What does hope really mean? And I said, well, it's looking to a time when, regardless of your situation, you know that God will restore you to where He intended you to be. Sometimes we think about hope and we think of it as like wishing or longing or like it's this desire to, but biblical hope is not that. Biblical hope isn't wishing that God will do something. Biblical hope is firmly knowing that God has promised to do something and you're patiently waiting for that to come to fruition, whether in this lifetime or the next. But sometimes a community of faithful people are really needed for people to maintain hope. Be in a tough situation by yourself, and you'll know that it's really hard to maintain hope sometimes. When stuff gets hard, it really can be hard to maintain hope. It's really hard to see past our situation without a community that gives us perspective. I think that at the very least, that's what we're here for, and that's why we're important. I think this testimony in Nehemiah, it's a reminder that no matter how devastating the disaster or how bad the offense, how bad the opposition, a united community with a shared purpose can overcome incredible challenge and rebuild stronger than before. I think like Nehemiah, we should always be focused on guarding our gates, valuing our heritage, and investing in our community. Join me in prayer. Father, we come before you today and we thank you. We thank you for the word that you've given us. We thank you for your scriptures, your Bible that's a word to us that was written for us so that we could be encouraged and we could thrive within our communities and know that no matter what the situation is, that we can rest in your hope and know that you will bring us to a place of rebuilding and restoration that's greater than anything we've experienced. We thank you for our community here, for a church that comes together and seeks to obey you in the ways that you intended, that we seek to build each other up at times, and we seek to worship you in the way that you fully deserve. We thank you that you've given us the opportunity to represent you, to be leaders in our community, because we're all leaders in some form or fashion, that you've given us the opportunity and the responsibility and the privilege of being image bearers for you, of being the vessels that you indwell. I pray that you'll continue to lead us, guide us, direct our community, that we would build each other up even more, that we would become a safe haven for those who need shelter, that we would become a safe haven for those who need protection, and that we would be a place where we worship you continuously. We love you.